This is a presentation from the Waupaca Historical Society.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Jerry Januszewski, and along with my dear wife, Sherry, we're honored to be here and want to welcome you to our talk about the history of brewing in Wisconsin and its beer barons. One of my favorite sayings came from Ben Franklin, who said, "Beer is proof that God loves us and wants us to be happy." Good for Ben. My son-in-law is from Holland, and over there they have a tradition that they'll toast people, and we have beverages here. Hopefully everyone has one. But what they do is, when they do the toast, they actually go, "Prost," and they stick their eyes out to the people next to them. So I'd like to do a little toast to get us started here. And on the count of three, we can go Prost. So there are good ships, there are wood ships, there are ships that sail to sea. But the best ships are friendships, and forever may they be. 1, 2, 3. Prost! Can everyone hear me all right? Okay. In the mid-1840s, Europe suffered a business depression, resulting in the loss of many jobs and political upheaval. It also suffered from a serious grain crop failure, which led to widespread famine. Fortunately, at this time, Milwaukee and Wisconsin were wide open for the settlement of these hard-working, knowledgeable immigrants. The Europeans, especially the Germans, brought with them some strong cultural traits, including farming and the ability to brew beer, and especially drink beer. They knew that brewed beer was safe to drink instead of the water, which could cause serious illness such as cholera. We have a shot of an old farm brewery here. Wisconsin offered them a similar climate and fertile soil to grow some of the ingredients necessary for brewing beer on their farm. The 4 ingredients are barley, hops, yeast, and water. Because of the poor transportation between cities, some of these frontier brewers and farmers would brew their own beer. Farming was their major source of income, and brewing was performed during the winter months. And it's notable to say that the women did the bulk of the brewing. So, these brewers/farmers were very particular in determining a location to make sure they had a good water source, such as a lake, a pond, or an artesian well, and fertile land on the property. Preferably, the farm brewery site was located on a hillside to accommodate easy construction of an underground beer cellar or cave. This gave them the ability to brew lager beers, which were popular in their homeland and required temperatures of 45 to 50 degrees for the fermentation process. Beer was stored in kegs and the cellars stocked with ice from local lakes or ponds. This is a good shot here. You see one of the caves and all the barrels that are fermenting in it. Ice houses were built and stocked with ice during the winter months by local farmers. The walls were insulated with sawdust, and the ice was buried in sawdust until it was required during the summertime. This is a shot of an ice house at Point Boss in Nakusa. They have an open-air museum out there, and if you look in the corner, you can see the ice, and it's covered with sawdust. The walls are insulated with sawdust, and as they need it, they uncover it and cover it back up. So many of these breweries were built on the outskirts of villages and were supported by their local community. An example of this occurred here in Waupaca, where Leonard Arnold started a brewery around 1858. The building was located on the banks of the Waupaca River, where Elm Street intersects Highway 49. There was a full basement and an ice house under the building, and Arnold's brewery produced around 100 barrels of beer a year. Records show that, unfortunately, while attending a 4th of July political campaign in 1869, one of Arnold's arms was blown off when a cannon accidentally discharged. So there's no mention of whether or not his beer was involved in this incident. I hope it wasn't. After Arnold's death in 1888, his son Albert operated at the brewery for a few years before he became the local distributor for the Schlitz Brewing Company. I want to thank Tracy for helping me with research for Arnold Brewery. Poor transportation and crude road construction made it tough to get beer from other than your local brewer until road conditions improved years later. Here's a slide where it shows one of the slides from the Wisconsin official markers. And to give you an idea of how tough it was to build roads, the Watertown Plank Road in Milwaukee was started in 1848, completed in 1853, 5 years later. It extended 58 miles west from Milwaukee on a course roughly paralleling State Street, past the Frederick Miller Plank Road Brewery, through Wauwatosa, Pewaukee, and Oconomowoc to Watertown. The $110,000 road of white oak planks provided a route for farm products, wood, lime, and passenger vehicles. And it cut round-trip travel time to 3 days. So it still took 3 days to get from Milwaukee just to Watertown, if you sort of know the geography there. And I always call it the old days superhighway. So, they could cut it down to that time. As the local community grew in size, the rural brewers found themselves located within urban areas and prospered, again, because it was very easy for people to get close to them. There's evidence of Wisconsin's first commercial brewery being operated by John Phillips in Mineral Point as far back as 1835. In this slide, you can see a photo of the old Mineral Springs Brewery building being used as a pottery shop today. From 1840 to 1870, there were an estimated 150 farm and commercial breweries throughout Wisconsin. Unfortunately, taxes and license fees implemented to reduce the government debt during the Civil War from 1861 to 1865 had a major impact on the smaller brewers, and many were forced to close their doors. Contrary to popular belief, in the Milwaukee area, a Welshman, Richard G. Owens, not a German, opened the first brewery. It was named the Lakefront Brewery, and he opened it in 1840. This is a photo of him, and also a photo of his tombstone in Forest Home Cemetery in Milwaukee. I had the opportunity to help film a show for Wales, England. They were so happy to hear that the Welshmen started brewing in Milwaukee. They came over here. They came out to Old World, Wisconsin where we do historic brewing demonstrations, and watched us brew some beer. They went to Wales, Wisconsin, which is just 30 miles from downtown Milwaukee. And then I took them and showed them the cemetery, and they really enjoyed that, and a tour of Milwaukee. So maybe I'll be an international TV star at some point, who knows. Several Germans followed Owens, including Jacob Best Sr., who established Best and Company Brewery in 1844, joined by his four sons, Jacob Jr., Philip, Charles, and Lorenz. This is an early sketch of their brewery, and as I had talked about earlier, if you'll notice, it's built on a hill, so they have access for beer caves. His sons, Charles and Lorenz, left a year later to establish their own business, and I'll get back to that in a minute. Sons Philip and Jacob Jr., who stuck around, ran the Best and Company Brewery with their father until 1859. That's when Philip became sole owner and changed the name to Philip Best Brewing Company. Meanwhile, in 1857, Captain Frederick Pabst earned his title to be the captain of the Goodrich steamship named the Comet, which operated on Lake Michigan. It turns out that Philip Best liked to use the Comet to commute to Chicago on Lake Michigan with his daughter Maria. It didn't take long for the captain to meet, charm, and marry Maria. There's a picture of the happy couple. They married in 1862, and the captain became vice president of the brewery 2 years later in 1864. 25 years later, in 1889, he took ownership of the company, and it was officially changed to the Pabst Brewing Company. He liked to breed and race Percheron horses, and I really like this shot because it shows how proud he was of all of his beer wagons for deliveries and his horses. And he also bred them at the Pabst farms, which back then were on the Washington Highlands. So he would enter them in the contest, and here are some ribbons. This was on an exhibit at the Milwaukee County Historical Society. He won these back at the 1904 World's Fair, which was in St. Louis, Missouri. And we're all familiar with the Budweiser Clydesdales. So for his Percheron horses to take 10 first place ribbons in St. Louis gave him an opportunity to really rub it in to Anheuser-Busch. Here's a sketch of the plant, which took 7 square blocks in downtown Milwaukee area and over 2,000 employees. Now, it's been known that some of the brewers would embellish these slides a little, add a building here or there. So how true that is, I don't know. Captain Pabst then led Pabst Brewing Company to national prominence, not only in the brewing industry, but with owning outstanding real estate. He had several hundred what are called tide houses and several hotels and restaurants throughout the United States. He had a hotel in Times Square, New York. He had restaurants in Harlem, as well as hotels going as far west as Los Angeles, hotels and restaurants. Now, I mentioned several hundred tide houses, and what that is the brewery would buy a building on a corner, a saloon, and they would rent it out to a proprietor. But that proprietor could only sell their beer. So if Pabst owned the building, they could only sell Pabst beer in that establishment. And so they were tied into the brewery, thus a tied house. And records show they had around 1,000 of these. So they had quite a bit of real estate. Pabst was very successful until his death in 1904 at the age of 68. And here's his death announcement that was released by the brewery back then. Died on New Year's Day, so not a happy start to the new year for the family.
Or the party was great the night before.
You never know. So meanwhile, getting back to Philip Best's sons, Charles and Lorenz, they became active competitors of their father. And they operated the Plank Road Brewing Company from 1850 to 1854. And that's when Lorenz passed away. Charles was distraught, and he closed the brewery, which was located several miles west of Milwaukee in the Menominee Valley. Here's a shot of it, and there is a replica of this building still standing on the east end of Miller. If you ever go to visit the Miller grounds and take a tour, it's still there. And now for the holidays, they'll have a big light show that they set up every evening. And it's really pretty magnificent to see. So if you're in the area, stop by and take a look at it at night. The Frederick Miller Brewing Company built a beautiful beer garden, and that was part of the German culture that they brought over the sea with them. And it attracted weekend crowds for lawn bowling, dancing, and other events. Miller was a resourceful businessman and hailed from a family of German politicians, scholars, and business owners. He was very good friends with Captain Pabst, even though the two were competitors. Miller was known for using clear glass bottling, and the Miller High Life beer became known as the champagne of bottled beers. His brewery began to grow, and he expanded into a new brew house shortly before he passed away in 1888. Our next beer baron, Joseph Schlitz, settled in Milwaukee in 1855. He was a bookkeeper for Krug's Brewery, which is K-R-U-G. August Krug opened that up in 1849 and unfortunately passed away in 1856. 2 years later, Joseph Schlitz married his widow, Anna. And Anna's middle name was Eli, or maiden name, was Eline. And so if anyone here is familiar with the Eline name, running Schlitz, that's where it came from. There's another sketch of the plant, and with Schlitz running the company, it experienced significant growth, and in 1874 he organized a stock company with himself as president and nephews August and Henry Eline as officers of the company. In 1871, the Great Chicago Fire destroyed much of that city and its brewing industry. Schlitz and the other Milwaukee breweries shipped bottled water and increased their production to make sure that the beer would continue to flow in Chicago. This is a photo of that after the fire went through. It's amazing to see the destruction. It almost looks like a bomb went off. And it really leveled a good portion of the city of Chicago. So as a result of all this help to them, their sales increased 50%. and soon they became known as the beer that made Milwaukee famous. The Joseph Schlitz Brewing Company expanded its location on 3rd and Walnut in Milwaukee and was headed to be the #1 brewery in America. Unfortunately, in 1875, the SS Schiller, a ship that Schlitz was on, had the misfortune of running into rocks southeast of Land's End, England, and his body was never recovered. Here's a shot of his tombstone. Again, this is in Forest Home Cemetery, where Richard G. Owens, the Welshman, was. And if you look at the top ribbon up there, it says, "Lost May 7th, 1875. It's a little hard to read, but it's up there. So he has a grave site without his body in it. The Forest Home Cemetery is located on the south side of Milwaukee and has several of the beer barons, their mausoleums, and they run tours now to show you all the beer barons. Pabst, Blatz, Schlitz, August Krug, who I talked about, Philip Best, Owens, they're all buried there. And if you are in the area and are interested, just look them up on their website and you can arrange for a tour.
You can also do a tour on your own. It's really easy. It's a very nice drive through the cemetery, and it's like going to an art museum. It's just gorgeous. It's just really beautiful. But you can online. There's also some like guides to where you can find different things in the cemetery. But it's a really nice tour. At Halloween they do a haunted tour, where they have people dressed up as like the beer barons hiding behind stones, and as they walk through the cemetery, they jump out and talk to them.
So after Schlitz's death, the Eline family took over the business, but the brewery and beer continued to be named after Schlitz because of the tremendous name recognition. We'll move on to Valentin Blatz, who had arrived in Milwaukee and worked for Johann Braun, who built a small brewery on the east side of Milwaukee known as City Brewery. After Braun passed away in 1851, Blatz married his widow. So a little similarity here. And her name Louisa, and he ended up creating the Blatz Brewing Company in 1852. Blatz became known as Milwaukee's finest beer. There's a nice sketch of their brewery, and this still exists today. A lot of it is condominiums and office buildings. In 1891, Blatz sold his brewery to the United States Brewing Company. Blatz was still the head of it and in full control until he passed away in 1894. A side note, Blatz closed their doors in 1959 and was purchased by the Pabst Brewing Company. G. Heilemann launched a monopoly antitrust suit in the courts against Pabst, and after 10 years of litigation was successful and purchased Blatz in 1969. The reason I mention this is it's significant if you track the consolidation in the brewing industry today. You have InBev, Anheuser-Busch, a couple of years ago purchased Molson Miller Coors, and the courts made them sell off some of their assets, but essentially it went through. Back in the 60s, when a brewery like Pabst wanted to buy a very small brewery, such as Blatz, they couldn't do it. It got tied up in the courts. Nowadays, anyone can buy anyone. So the times have really changed. If you heard within the last couple of weeks, Molson, it was Molson Miller Coors, has now dropped Miller out of the name. So it's now Miller Coors. No longer is Miller in the name.
Molson Coors.
What is it?
Molson Coors, not
Molson Coors. It's not Miller. Miller's out of it. And the trade-off is they said they're going to bring more jobs into Milwaukee. And, you know, you're losing that name, which I think is a big step to lose that recognition. Statistics for largest brew, yes?
I also read, but they're keeping the Miller beer line.
Oh, yeah.
Getting rid of the name.
Yeah.
Of the company.
Statistics for largest brewers in 1895 show Pabst sold 1 million barrels, Anheuser-Busch 800,000 barrels, Joseph Schlitz 700,000, and Blatz was in seventh with 400,000. In 1902, Schlitz surpassed Pabst to be number one in the country. Most of the brewers in Milwaukee and Wisconsin thrived until January 16, 1920, when Prohibition suspended the production of alcoholic beverages. This is one of my favorite pictures here of the temperance movement. It says, "Lips that touch liquor shall not touch ours." And I don't know if I want to touch those lips. It's a pretty scary bunch. And then here you can see where the feds ordered the dumping of the beer at one of the breweries. And I always call that a good definition of alcohol abuse. The brewers survived by producing near beer, soda, malt extract, tonic water, and dairy products such as ice cream and cheese. On this slide, we have Latz gum. They had a great gum. Here's an ad where everybody's chewing it for the romantic moment. Latz had Gold Star Ginger Ale, and Miller very fine lemon soda. Just about all of the breweries made what was called a malt extract. And this was a very heavy concentration of malted barley that was brewed and canned. And they marketed it as a useful ingredient in breads and desserts. By the way, we have some beer bread here tonight. But it was also flavored with hops, so I don't think that would have worked real good. But what people did, and they sold a lot of this during Prohibition, they would add 1 can of this to a gallon of boiling water, mix it with 4 gallons of cold water, let it cool off a little, add some yeast, cover it for a week, and they had their beer. So it was a way around Prohibition, and it was a way for the breweries to survive.
Start a home brewing, huh?
So here's Pabst. They opened up a dairy on their farm where they were breeding the horses, and that was called Pabst Cheese. They ended up later, years later, selling that to Kraft. And does anyone want to guess what the name of that Pabst cheese is today? Velveeta. So they had Lime Ricky, Pabst tonic water, and they made a variety of sodas, including root beer. The Elines and Schlitz opened up their own chocolate factory. There's a sketch of it, and this was on the northeast side of Milwaukee. They made quite an investment, And you can see the Eline's chocolate candy bar, a dictionary, their old style cocoa. And this lasted around 10 years before they ended up selling it. It just didn't make the profit that they wanted. This is a shot to show how they were marketing some of their beer, how mother and baby picked up. A case of Blatt's beer in your home means much to the young mother, and obviously baby participates in its benefits. The malt in the beer supplies nourishing qualities that are essential at this time, and the hops act as an appetizing, stimulating tonic. So, always good to have a Blatz around, right? So Prohibition finally ended on December 5th, 1933. Criminals such as Al Capone were making millions of dollars during Prohibition, and the feds realized, hey, we can charge taxes, and so they would heavily tax alcohol afterwards to make some money rather than let the criminals take it all. Unfortunately, the combination of the Great Depression and Prohibition forced many breweries, bars, and restaurants to close their doors throughout Wisconsin and the country. And it was a failed experiment, and it's just too bad it had to happen. I think it helped to lead to the Great Depression myself. Today there's a revival of breweries known as craft breweries throughout the state, as history is repeating itself. Locally, you have H.H. Hinder Brewing Company here within a mile, and 22 Lakes Brewing Company, which I've heard is 2 or 3 blocks from here. Maybe we can all stop there afterwards. And these breweries will rely on your local support because they can't afford shelf space in the stores, and they have to survive off of the revenue that they generate in their tap rooms. In the US, there are over 7,000 breweries and counting. It eclipses the historic mark of 4,131 breweries back in 1873. And again, that's history repeating itself because back then every little city had its own brewery. But they had their own little brewery because of transportation limitations. There are over 50 breweries now operating in the Milwaukee metropolitan area alone, and that number is on the rise annually. I had mentioned I volunteer out at Old World, Wisconsin, which is in Eagle, Wisconsin. It's an open-air museum, and during the summer, we do historic brewing demonstrations from the 1860s. And I invite you to stop out. You can go on their website. I have some materials in the back. You can grab a card and check it out. But we go out there every other Saturday. Our goal is to eventually open up a brewery. And we've been doing fundraising for that. And we're hoping to break ground the end of next year and brew out of our own facility out there by 2021. We have a little clip here to show you.
Take me 1 minute here. We had some technical difficulties, so this is how you're going to hear it. Hopefully.
Brewing beer is a Wisconsin tradition. And now it's brought to life at Old World, Wisconsin. Our historic brewing program at Old World recreates 19th century beer using equipment and techniques from brewmasters of long ago. Heirloom hops and barley are grown on our historic farms, and guests are invited to help with the annual harvest. There are special days throughout the summer and fall where you can visit with our dedicated and trained brew crew while they work. Guests age 21 and over can taste a sample of the historic beer or enjoy a beverage from one of our partner craft breweries. A partnership between Old World, Wisconsin and the Museum of Beer and Brewing makes these special days possible. Please visit our website's event calendar to discover when we'll be brewing up the next batch. We are brewing history at Old World, Wisconsin. Considered one of the top 10 outdoor history attractions in the country, located in Eagle, Wisconsin. For more information, please visit oldworldwisconsin.org.
So that's what we're doing out there every other Saturday. And as you can see, we're trying to make it as similar to back in the 1860s as we can. We have our own hop garden, our own barley field, and so just like those farmers were doing back then in the middle 1800s, we're doing our own brewing.
I'll give a plug for it too. It's a great place to take kids, grandkids, nieces, nephews. There's a trolley that takes you through this, so you don't have to walk through the whole place. But what's really nice is when Jerry started brewing out there, we took our grandkids out there, and they get to grind the grain in the grist mill. They get to pick hops off the vine. I have hops. We have a house on Lake Camelot over in Rome, and I have hops growing on the side of our deck as a privacy fence because they're so pretty and they smell good. But what happened the first time I took one of our grandsons out there, he got to know that beer just doesn't come off the shelf in the grocery store. The people actually have to do something to make this, and this is how they make it. It's not the big breweries that they see at, we live in Milwaukee, so we see Miller and, they've been to Lakefront and all the different breweries, but this is how they made it. And so they get an appreciation for the fact that they had to grow the things that they used to make the beer. And it's a great place. There's chickens running around and cows right next to the brewery, and so it's a really fun place to go. It's a great day trip. You can go in there and, like I say, ride the trolley to the different villages, and it's very authentic and it's a lot of fun.
What part of the state is that?
It is west of Milwaukee. So what is it from here?
If you're familiar with Oconomowoc, it's just south of there, maybe 15, 20 miles. I'm always trying to link how history is recreating itself, not only with the amount of breweries, but also with the beer barons. Nowadays, you have Sprecher Brewing, Randy Sprecher. You have Russ Klisch from Lakefront Brewing. You have Deborah and Dan Carey from New Glarus. And I know Ken Grossman out at Sierra Nevada. You're really starting to get some high dollar beer barons out there again. And it's good to see history repeating itself like that. On the other avenue, you have a lot of people who have a passion for brewing beer, and they open up a craft brewery because they enjoy brewing beer, but they don't have a lot of the business knowledge. And so I think you're starting to see some of these small breweries closing, and as soon as we get a recession, I think you're going to see a lot more of it,
And I think
unfortunately.
I think there's a lot of pressure too on the small breweries, especially in Milwaukee. I mean, I have 100 choices of places to go to have a beer. If I go to a place and it's not a good beer, I'm not going back. And a lot of these guys that you talk to who've started a small brewery, they were brewing in their house and all their friends told them their beer was wonderful. So then they brew it in a brewery and it's not so great. I have too many choices, so they have to find a way to make their beer something that's marketable. You know, they've got to have one that I'm gonna go back to because there was a beer there that I liked. I'm not gonna go back and the next time I go there, all they have is IPAs. I don't like IPAs. Or all they have are barrel aged. I don't, you know, whoever doesn't like that, they've gotta have a mix. So I think that there's a lot of pressure on the breweries, and they're hardworking people. So support your local breweries, give them some feedback. They do appreciate the feedback when you go in there and say, you know what, maybe I'd like to see something else. So they do appreciate that.
Now, another place where I volunteer is, if anyone's familiar with Potosi, Wisconsin, it's in the southwestern corner of the state. To give you an idea, it's 6 miles from Dubuque, Iowa. So it's just on our side of the Mississippi River. And there's an old Potosi brewing company which opened in 1857, and it is now the National Brewery Museum. I have cards back there if you'd like. Please grab one. So I'm the vice president of that and the American Breweriana Association, which runs it. We put up new displays, we keep it clean, and it's pretty interesting to see. There's also a Potosi Brewing Company that was built right across the parking lot, and possibly you see Potosi in stores around here. I know they have a pretty good distribution network. So we started with Ben Franklin, and I thought it'd be fitting to end with Ben.
Oh, sorry.
Little did Ben Franklin know that it would take a Ben on a $100 bill to buy 1 bottle of beer these days. So there's a lot of collector beers being made out there. And this bottle of beer here is made by Lakefront Brewing in Milwaukee. And they have what's called a Black Friday celebration. People will stand in line, over 2,000 people will start camping out at midnight Thanksgiving evening to be there when they open at 6 a.m. on Friday morning, Black Friday. And they're going to sell this 1 bottle of beer for $100. It's a culmination of 5 different beers over the last 5 years that are mixed, and just gives you an idea of what's going on in the marketplace nowadays. Boston Brewing has a beer, it's called Utopia. I don't know if anyone's seen it. And those are going for close to $250 for 1 bottle. But that is, I believe, like 23 or 24% alcohol by volume. And I would imagine this is close to 14 or 15%. So thank you, Ben Franklin. So I hope that my presentation gives you a better insight as to why the brewing industry is such a huge part of Wisconsin's history and heritage. I also want to thank you for being a part of conserving and protecting history by supporting the Waupaca Historical Society, exemplified with your presence here tonight. I also want to thank the Badger's Den Brew Club and the Fenskys who have sponsored this event this evening. So there are drinks, some refreshments, and I hope that you enjoy it. So thank you, and I'll open it up to questions. Yes?
Are any of those caves still in operation where they stored beer?
Where?
The caves,
But where?
the beer caves, in the state anywhere.
Well, there are caves right in Potosi,
There are, okay.
the old ones. There are some, like Miller still has some caves there. There are several, but you really have to search them out.
Yeah.
Yes?
What are the kegs made of? And where can they buy them anymore? I mean,
Well,
they're gonna use all our forest.
back then, they're made mainly out of oak, and you had what was called a cooper and cooperages where they would make beer barrels and sell them to the breweries.
But they don't use wooden kegs anymore at the big breweries.
It's coming back. There, again, you talk about history repeating itself. A lot of these craft brewers, right here in Amherst alone, Central Waters Brewing does a lot of their brewing in old bourbon barrels.
Well, they age it.
Yes, so they're aging beer in them, and so that it's starting to be a craft again where coopers are making barrels. And you see all sorts, you see tequila barrels, wine barrels that they're aging beer in, and then that beer draws the flavor out of the wood. So, yes?
Okay, I heard that people go to Germany and they drink it warm. When you hear that,
We drink it warm here.
We've been there a couple of times, and I really don't notice it being
okay.
noticeably
You
warmer.
serve it at Old World, Wisconsin, do you serve it cold?
Yes. And we do serve what we brewed a couple of weeks prior. We can serve samples of that. So if you do come out there, you can sample our prior beers. When we had the group out there from Wales, we were able to make a Welsh ale, and that was real interesting. Had some very interesting ingredients in it.
And the different kinds of beer taste different at different temperatures. So I am a barrel aged girl. I love bourbon barrel aged beer, but I do not want it cold.
No,
I
it's
want
gotta
it
warm up.
warm. So I'll get it, if I go into a bar and they give me a cold beer, I put it in my hands and I warm it up, because as it warms up, you get a different flavor. You get that wine, bourbon-y flavor, you get that warm feeling when you drink it. It's like great. But different beers taste different as they get warm. IPAs, some of them are bitter at first, but I found that I don't like IPAs, but if I let them get a little warmer, then they taste more fruity to me. So as you try different beers, taste them at different temperatures, and you'll find the difference in the flavor.
A lot of it is personal preference. So during the middle of summer, I don't want a dark stout or porter beer. I'll take a Pilsner, and after mowing the lawn, goes down in 2 seconds. It's very refreshing. Whereas if you handed me a stout after, I'd probably take 15 minutes to drink that down. Lee, you had a question?
I'm just going to make a comment that we've already had a speaker at our museum. At one time, one of the largest barrel makers in the United States was just outside Madison. And so,
Gary Hess?
yes,
Sure.
yeah. And also want to make a comment that I worked in Port Washington. I knew at one time when I was a younger kid, through my dad, the brewmaster at Port Washington Brewery, the beer that made Milwaukee furious. But they were doing some construction, and lo and behold, they found some caves in one of the hillsides that nobody knew even existed, that they had used to store the beer.
Well, sure.
I'd just like to say, anybody in here that's interested in learning to brew or to join a club, we are the Badger Den Brewing Club. Matter of fact, we had our meeting right here last night, and we start our meeting with presentations and sampling. We hold our meetings the second Wednesday of every month, but our next meeting won't be until January, because December we usually have a holiday party instead of a meeting. So if anybody's interested, we are on the internet or on Facebook, or if you know anybody around town, feel free to stop in here the second Wednesday of January 2020.
Yes, sir.
When you brew at Old World, Wisconsin, do you use a historical recipe, or do you just vary it from time to time?
We do use some historical recipes.
What classic hops? Do you use 6-row versus?
We have a Hallertau hop,
Sure.
and it's a legacy hop.
Sure.
And we also, our barley is from the 1850s. We got it from North Dakota State. where they've been propagating it ever since. And so it's a legacy barley that we're using. The main beer we make is an American cream ale. And with that, we got to put a little cornflake in it and stuff. But we'll try different beers now and then. We'll try a porter and a Bach beer. So, yes.
Larry, what is in the bottle back there? It's pellets.
Okay. On the back table, again, please feel free to take a look at that afterwards. But there are all the brewing ingredients, and there are hops that are in their natural state. And thank you, Roger. There's a jar of pellets. What the hop companies will do is they pelletize their hops, and then they refrigerate them so that they'll last much longer. And they can last 2 or 3 years in a cooler when they're pelletized. Whereas if it's just a cone, they don't have the longevity. Yes?
Now, you didn't mention Leinenkugel at all as far as a Wisconsin brewery. How you know, were they much smaller than the Milwaukee breweries? And time-wise, when they started?
They were smaller, just like Point Brewery, close by. That was sort of a middle-of-the-road type brewery. Reason I don't mention them is you gotta limit it somewhere, you know. But no, it's a good point. Leinenkugel's been around forever, as well as Point was 1857, I believe. And you look at Point, they probably went through close to 10 ownership changes over the years, and different names, etc. But I can remember back in 1973, when I just turned 18, aging myself a little, but there was a writer in Chicago called Mike, his name was Mike Royko, and he did an independent taste test. And somehow Point got involved with that, and they took first in America. So there was a foreign beer, and then Point was the first American beer. And that helped their marketing by, I heard, surging 25%. And I think it helped to maintain them through the 1980s, 1990s. And they started distributing out of state, and they just kept snowballing, and they're doing very well today.
Didn't they just win another gold medal at the GABF?
I haven't heard that.
Does Greenbelt still make beer?
Yeah, Greenbelt has been resurrected. To mention Point, one of my favorite beers, I enjoy it. So, and my mother's from the Point area, so I've always enjoyed Point.
Who brews Greenbelt?
I don't know who.
Minnesota.
Some brewer out in Minneapolis area has started with it again. Yes?
I believe during Prohibition, there was a woman in Oshkosh that actually supported her family during that time by selling probably the malt product out of a small grocery store.
Okay.
But according to historical facts, there were a lot of men in and out of that store.
I do a presentation on Prohibition, so when I did the research on that, it's very interesting. Not a lot of people paid attention to it. And it was really how the local law enforcement handled it. Some of them just turned their heads, whereas others would crack down. But I think because of how lax it was here, we didn't have the criminal element that Chicago had. And other areas, New York, LA, they were pretty bad also. So, well, thank you very much.
Thank you.